Good evening, everyone. Hope you are all having a great Sunday, and thank you for listening to another Bible class here at Marion Street Church of Christ. As you can see, we are still doing our online Bible class here on Sundays only, so everyone is watching online today. I've been doing a little bit more work from home, so today you are getting to see me inside my home as we've done from time to time here during these Sunday night Bible studies. Let's go ahead and turn to the book of Ezra, chapter 3. That's where we will spend all of our time this evening, Ezra chapter 3 and 4. And as you're doing that, I'd like to catch everyone up. Want to welcome you all. If you can like and share this post, that would let everyone find this a little bit easier as we go throughout the week. Not everyone can watch it at 5 o'clock on Sundays, but it helps people find it easier when you like and share this and comment and let us know that you're watching with us. We started the book of Ezra last week. We went over Ezra 1 and 2. The week before that, we did some little introductory material with Ezra and Nehemiah. Our theme this year at Marion Street Church of Christ is called Down But Not Out. And after the year we've all had, we all understand that we have been knocked down, but that doesn't mean we need to stay down. We're not out of this yet. And so we talked about, during our introductory class 2 weeks ago, Ezra and Nehemiah are perfect examples of that, because we have the children of Israel who have been in captivity for several years now, and the transition of power from Babylon to Persia has now taken place. And Persia, Cyrus, the king of Persia in particular, was allowing the Jews, allowing the Israelites to return to their homeland, to return to Jerusalem, so that they can rebuild their city, rebuild their temple. And so that's what we talked about in chapters 1 and chapter 2. We talked about the end of Babylonian captivity. We talked about how Cyrus was allowing them to go back home, not only going back home, but going back home and getting some help along the way with materials and resources from outside countries. And then in chapter 2, we talked about all those people that return. Chapter 2 is kind of I guess what we would call a boring chapter, because it's just a big old list of names. But we talked about the importance of these were people that survived captivity. These were people who were resilient. These were people who God loved and brought back to the promised land. Just like you and I, we are living in a world and living in a time where sin runs rampant. But if we're resilient, if we're strong, we keep our faith in the Lord, He'll bring us home. This time, not to a land of Jerusalem, but to the promised land. So you can go back and you could look and watch last week's video on Ezra's 1 and 2. But we're going to pick up with Ezra chapter 3 and 4. And as I mentioned, since we do have so many people who aren't normal members at Marion Street Church of Christ watching this video throughout the week, I'll just remind you of what we're doing. We have Ezra and Nehemiah to get through in now 11 weeks. We have 11 classes left. We've already been through 2. And what that means is that means we will not be going verse by verse. We just can't. And so we will be going more thought by thought, trying to give more the big picture of what's happening throughout these books, trying to give a little bit more application as well to what is being talked about here in these Old Testament books. Sometimes Old Testament books, they get this bad rap for, what do they mean for me today? Well, there's a lot in here that I think we can take, and we looked at some of that last week already. So hopefully this will help you as well. But Ezra 3 and 4 is where we're going to be tonight. So if you remember, what we did in chapter 2 was we had that big old long list of people who were coming back to the promised land. And it leaves us in verse 70. I know it was a long chapter, but verse 70. The priests and Levites, some of the other people, the singers, the gatekeepers, the Nethinim, dwelt in their cities, and all Israel in their cities. So now everyone is now dwelling safely in where they were before they left, and they're finding their dwellings. Well, then we pick up, and now life is going to start getting back to normal. And now, especially where they start, I think is very interesting. But you have something that's said here in the very first verse of chapter 3. It says, "And when the 7th month had come, and the children of Israel were in the cities, the people gathered together as one man to Jerusalem." This is what's interesting. Now, sometimes when we read something like the 7th month, that could mean the 7th month that they were there. Or sometimes you'll see, like when the prophets were writing, they'll be in the first year of the reign of King so-and-so, right? And so sometimes that's when you list a date like that, that's what that means. However, here it's actually listing the seventh month. It's like of the Israelite, the Hebrew calendar. This is their seventh month. And that might just seem out of place for a lot of people, or not even out of place. They might just not know what the significance behind that is. So it's very easily gone over and just forgotten about. But it's so important why Ezra put this in here. Who Ezra, what a lot of people believe, was from a priestly line. And so it's interesting that he puts that the seventh month. That's where we are in their year. And that's because the seventh month was so important spiritually to the children of Israel. You had three things happening in the seventh month of the Hebrew calendar. One, you had the Feast of Trumpets, which became a huge celebration about God's victory for his people, and they would offer sacrifices. And that was started on the first of the month. And so big on sacrifices, big on celebrating. They would blow trumpets. It later became associated with their new year, actually, even though it's the seventh month. I understand it's confusing. But then about halfway through the month, right on the tail end of the Feast of Trumpets, you had the Day of Atonement during the same month, which was arguably one of the biggest holidays, if not the biggest holiday in Israel's calendar. That was the day that God would really forgive and atone for the sins of the people. And so what they would do, remember, is they would have two goats, and they would bring those goats before the people and to the priests. And one goat would have their hands laid on the head of the priest. The priests lay their hands on the head, and they would send that goat into the wild to be the scapegoat. He was carrying the sins of the people away from their camp. And then the second goat would actually be killed, and the blood would be taken to the most holy place, which was the only time of the year that the priest could enter into the most holy place, and they'd sprinkle the blood of that goat for atonement of sins on the throne of God. And then you also had in the seventh month the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tents, as it's also called. And what that was a remembrance of the children of Israel who were living and wandering in the wilderness. And so when God established that, he said, you're going to go actually outside the city, outside of your homes. You're going to live in tents for a week. You're going to offer sacrifices. You're going to do all these things with, and we can go back to Numbers and things like that in Leviticus to get more information on that. But it became a big event in the seventh month of their year to commemorate that God took care of the children of Israel as they were wandering in the wilderness. And so here we are back to Ezra. He mentions this is the seventh month. And so this was a big month for the children of Israel because you had these three feasts, these three special holidays back to back to back, and all of them required sacrifices. And so let's just think about this logically. You now enter into the city of Jerusalem, and it's laying in ruins. You have the temple, you have the walls that were all crumbled, their homes, the city was just completely ruined. And now you're coming up on some of your major holidays. Well, what's the first thing you would want to get up? I mean, you don't have time to build up the walls. You don't have time to build the temple. That's going to take years to do for some of those things. Actually, Nehemiah does the walls fairly quicker than that, and that's a feat in and of itself we'll get to in the next book. But with all these feasts coming up, the first thing that they do was erect their burnt offering altar at the tabernacle site, or at the temple site. I'm sorry, the temple, not the tabernacle. And so what they do is they come, and it says in verse 3, though fear had come upon them because of the people of those countries, they set the altar on its bases, and they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord because the morning and both the morning and the evening offerings. They also kept the Feast of Tabernacles, as it is written, and offered the daily burnt offerings in the number required by the ordinance of each day. And so afterwards, they offered, in verse 5, they offered the regular burnt offering and those for the new moons and for all the appointed feasts of the Lord that were consecrated, and those of everyone willingly offered a free will offering to the Lord. And so I think what's interesting is in verse 3, now you did have some surrounding, they were fearing some of the surrounding nations, and that's why it mentions there in verse 3, the fear had come upon them because of the people in those countries, which we'll get to that in just a moment as well. But notice what it says. They set the altar on its bases. What does that mean? The word bases means foundations. So they set this altar on its foundations. What they did was they went back to the original site of the temple. And I want you to picture this for a minute. The temple's here laying in ruins. That's going to be rebuilt later, of course. But the temple's laying in ruins. But what they were able to do is they were able to find the exact spot that the altar would have been placed upon for the burnt offerings. And they went and they rebuilt the altar right in the exact spot where Solomon had the altar built for his grand temple. And we'll talk more about Solomon's temple here in just a moment. But it's fascinating to me. And you can get into the reasons why. Why? Well, because it was probably a quick thing to build. It's something that they can build real fast to get their worship going again. But that was the main point, is that when they got there and they looked at this temple and it's laying in ruins and there's rocks and rubble all over the place, here, then they find this spot. This is where the altar was. Well, we can rebuild this fairly quickly. And so what they did was they rebuilt that in the exact same place so that they can begin offering their sacrifices. And it says not only were they offering sacrifices for these feasts, it says they began offering sacrifices in the morning and evening, as is written in the books. And so they began their worship all over again. And that's so significant because here they are for the very first time in years able to come back to the exact spot and start worshiping their God again. Now, what does that mean for us, and why is that so significant for us? Because sometimes I feel like for us in New Testament Christianity, especially after this past year, it's really easy to take the year off. It was very easy to take the year off, and a lot of people have. A lot of people, and I'm not trying to point fingers because I know there's certain situations all over the place that maybe hindered people from coming to services or doing things like they would normally do. So I understand that. I'm not throwing anyone under the bus. But I will say there's a large group of people who have just taken this year and they've used it as a year off. They've used it as a year to say, well, you know what, I'm going to do the bare minimum. I'm going to do nothing at all. We're not going to come to services. And again, I know there's circumstances that people want to be there and just can't. So that's not the point of what I'm trying to say. But the point of what I'm trying to say is there's some people's hearts that have completely stopped with God. They've completely stopped worshiping. They've completely stopped trying. This has been the excuse to take the year off. Well, here's what I think is so important about these passages, is that you can come back. You could start again. Here's the children of Israel been in captivity for so long, and they're finally able to come back to Jerusalem, and then they want to start worshiping again at the exact spot that it always used to happen at Solomon's temple, this great temple. They find those foundations of the burnt offering altar, and then they rebuild it again. It's not too late for you to rebuild what was torn down. And maybe you've taken this year off, and maybe you've decided that now's the time to get going again. Well, let's get going again. Let's start rebuilding. Go back to the foundations that you've had. You love God, you trust God, you want to worship Him again. Well, come back to services, come back to Bible class. I'm glad you're watching this because that means you're trying at least a little bit. But it's time. It's time to come back and rebuild on the foundations and start worshiping once again. And so that's so significant for the children of Israel here as they continue to start picking up the pieces to rebuild their lives. Starting in verse 8, what you have is you have the temple beginning to be built. Now, this talks about here in verse 8, this was the second year, or the second month of the second year of their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem. And so it had taken a little bit of time, and there's a reason for that. And that's because, remember, Cyrus gave them a decree to get materials from the surrounding nations. And so it took several years, it took several months to once obviously they got there and they traveled to Jerusalem, they had to get themselves settled in. And then they had to start getting all the materials from all over the place. Well, here we are, the second month of the second year, and they can finally start building and appointing the leaders to build the temple, which again is just a huge feat for the children of Israel. To not only, again, you have them coming out of captivity, but also to now they have to find the priests, and they have to get the priests going again, and then they have to get all the materials to build the temple again, and that took several years. This isn't like you just call a construction company and say, can you get this done, and they get it done in no time. No, they're having to transport these materials from surrounding nations and surrounding territories, and they're having to line all this up. And then finally in verse 10, it says that the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord. The priests stood in their apparel with trumpets, and the Levites, the son of Asaph, with cymbals, to praise the Lord according to the ordinance of David, king of Israel. And so here you have finally the temple of the Lord being rebuilt. And it's just another, again, just fascinating moment in the children of Israel's history, that they were down and out. They were in captivity for years. Not only were they able to come back, but now they have the materials to start building, and the foundation is being laid to the Lord's temple. Let's not lose its significance here. This is where the Lord would dwell among his people. This is a huge deal. This is where they worship. This was their livelihood. This is what made them a people. And they're finally able to start. Building that foundation. Now you have mixed reactions here, which I think is interesting, and there's a lesson in here for us, I believe, as well. You have all the people shouting with a great shout. It says in verse 11, they were shouting with a great shout. They praised the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. So this was a big celebration, and man, they were celebrating big time. But then you had in verse 12, many of the priests and Levites and the heads of the fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first temple, they wept with a loud voice when the foundation of this temple was laid before their eyes. Yet many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not discern the noise of the shout of joy from the noise of weeping of the people, for the people shouted with a loud shout, and the sound was heard afar off. You had two different reactions here. You had a majority of the people who were just so excited that the temple was being laid again, was being built again. The foundations were being laid. They were shouting so loud, and they were shouting with so much excitement. It says that the sound was heard from afar off. But then you had a second group of people, and probably much smaller, based on where we know their age was. But these were the people who would have seen the first temple before it was destroyed. They remembered living. They remembered living in Israel before. They remember probably going to the temple to offer sacrifices with their parents or their grandparents. They remember worship, what it was like before captivity. And here they're looking at the foundation of the Lord and of the temple. And they just start weeping because it wasn't what it was like before. There's a couple lessons I think that are important in that. One is younger people. Sometimes we have a tendency to look at the older and say, well, get with the program. But sometimes we can learn something, and we can learn some reverence and awe from the older generation. And sometimes they're struggling because they see things and understand things that maybe us younger people don't understand. And we should have some respect for the older generation to know what they've seen and to learn what they know, so that we can learn and we can grow as well. But two, there's an older generation. And it's very easy for the older generation to look back and say, well, they just don't understand. They're doing it so different now. It's not like what it used to be. But don't squash the enthusiasm of the younger generation. You have a younger generation here who had never seen the temple before. They'd only heard it of stories, and they had only heard about what Solomon's temple looked like, which was a huge wonder of the world at that point in time. And yet here they are being able to come back to their hometown and finally start rebuilding what they had only heard about. This was exciting for them. And this was an exciting moment. This was a moment in their history that they would never forget. Sure, listen, they didn't have the resources that Solomon had. They didn't have the money that Solomon had. Someone, I think, did a report one time, and they said that Solomon would have spent the equivalent of like $5 to $9 billion on his of our money today on his temple. That was extravagant. These people didn't have that. These people were doing the best they can. Was it upsetting? It wasn't like what it was before. Yeah, the old people wept. But that's no reason to squash the enthusiasm of the young people who are experiencing something for the very first time, who are seeing something for the very first time, and who are excited to worship. Don't squash the enthusiasm of young Christians when they're just excited to worship. Teach. Let the older generation teach. Let them encourage. Maybe the older generation can learn something from the younger, and maybe the younger can learn something from the older. The point is this: encourage each other, and encourage each other to worship the way God intended to be worshipped. And there's a lot more lessons with that. We won't have the time tonight to get into it. But chapter four is going to be a whole lot quicker to go through, and that's because it's very different, I guess, than what we just read in chapter 3. But basically, in chapter 4, you have now the adversaries of the children of Israel are coming out. They've obviously taken notice that the children of Israel have come back into the land, that they're rebuilding their temple. And if you're an outsider looking in, that's a big problem because, again, these surrounding territories and nations, they would have remembered Israel. They would have remembered Israel's problems. They would have remembered Israel was a thorn in the flesh for all the surrounding nations. They came in, they took over the people in the conquest of Joshua and the conquest of Canaan. And not only that, but they continually were getting in skirmishes and wars and fights with the surrounding nations like the Philistines. And then you had Saul going to war. You had David going to war. David conquered just almost the whole little territory there. And then you had constant turmoil during the kings and the prophets and just so many problems. Problems as well with the Babylonians when they came in. If you know anything about the history between the Israelites and the Babylonians, the Israelites put up a really good fight, and they were really pesky to the Babylonians, especially right before the Babylonians took over Jerusalem and laid siege to that. And so you have these surrounding nations who are looking and saying, well, wait a minute, we've seen this before. Or at least we've heard these stories before. The children of Israel come in, and they took everything. And they claimed that this was their land, and they claimed that we couldn't live here or we had to be their slaves. We went to war with them. Our people have been at war with them for years and years and years. We don't want them here again. We've been doing really well for ourselves since they've been in captivity. And now they get to come back in, and they also think about this. For about 70 years plus, Israel's been gone from Jerusalem. Well, other people have moved in. And that's where you get a lot of the Samaritan problems as well coming into the New Testament. But here you have the Israelites coming back and saying, nope, this is our town. This is where we live. This is our temple. This is our holy site. This is our promised land. Now you see where some of the tensions are as well in the Middle East today, because this is what has been constantly going on. But you have these surrounding nations saying, well, we're not going through this again. We're going to try to get this taken care of. So they actually write a letter. They write a letter to Xerxes. They write a letter to Artaxerxes, which are the leaders of Israel, of Persia, and basically what their goal was to frustrate the Israelites to no end. And in fact, that's really what it says in verse 5. It says, well, we'll start in verse 4 of chapter 4. It says, the people of the land tried to discourage the people of Judah. They troubled them in the building. They hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Darius would allow the building to continue, but until then, you went through several leaders of Persia where these people were trying to convince the leaders of Persia to not let these people be a people, to not let these people continue in the path of rebuilding their nation, because when they get too powerful, we know what's going to happen. They're going to take us over again, and they're going to be pesky, and we don't like that. So let's take care of this before it gets to be a problem. So they actually wrote a letter, and they wrote a letter to Xerxes and to Artaxerxes, his son, and you can read that from verses 9 through 22, and basically it's saying, in a nutshell, we don't think you should support these people. These people have a history, and their history is not a good one. Their history is, they're not going to pay you taxes. They're gonna take your money. They're going to rebuild their city and turn against you, and they're going to try to fight against you. They've been harmful. They've harmed us. They said, this is what I think is so interesting. In verse 15, of chapter 4, it says, search may be made in the book of the records of your fathers, and you will find in the book of records and know that this city is a rebellious city, harmful to kings and provinces, and that they have incited sedition within the city in former times, for which cause this city was destroyed. So they're telling, the surrounding nations are writing this to the leaders of Persia, saying, you need to get a grip on these people. They're getting too powerful. And if you go back and you look in your history books, you're going to see a group of people that they are rebellious. They're a rebellious city. They're harmful to kings and provinces, and they incited sedition within this very city that they're trying to rebuild. They took a stand against Babylon, and they did a pretty good job. Now, Babylon eventually took them over, but they're saying, this is what they're saying in verse 16. We inform the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, the result will be that you will have no dominion beyond the river. In other words, he's saying, this will be your end. They're going to be able to rebuild their city. They're going to regain power, and there's nothing that you could do to stop them once they come back to power. And so, the Xerxes and Artaxerxes and the leaders of Persia, they listened to that. And Artaxerxes sent a letter back. And he says this in verse 18. He says, the letter which you sent to us has been clearly read before me. And I gave the command, and a search has been made, and it was found that this city in former times has revolted against kings, and rebellion and sedition have been fostered in it. There have also been mighty kings over Jerusalem, who have ruled over in all of the region beyond the river, and tax and tribute and custom were paid to them. Now give the command to make these men cease, that this city may not be built until the command is given by me. Take heed now that you do not fail to do this. Why should damage increase to the hurt of the kings? Basically, Artaxerxes is saying, I did exactly what you asked me to do. I went and looked at the records. The records are exactly as you say. They're pesky people that if they get too much power, they're going to take over. And of course, it's all through the power of God. We know that. But Artaxerxes says, it's exactly as you say. We need to get them to stop. And so it says in verse 23, now when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before them, their companions, they went up in haste to Jerusalem against the Jews, and by the force of arms made them cease. Thus the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, ceased, and it was discontinued until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So there is now a time where this great triumph that happened in chapter 3 was now put on hold because of outside forces. And they just had to sit because they were afraid of what would happen in Jerusalem if they would start to rebuild and regain the power they once had. Now there's some lessons in that. And that is that sometimes when things are going good in our lives, people want to take us down a notch. And unhappy people try to make happy people unhappy. And that's no reason to get us down. Now, we're going to get to the rest of the story here because in chapter 5, the restoration of the temple was able to continue. So we know the temple will be restored. But sometimes in the middle of our triumphs, we have people who they like to rain on our parade. We can't control that. Just like these people couldn't control the inner workings of what was going on behind them. But what we can control is our attitude. We can control who we continue to worship. We can control who we continue to love. We can control how we continue to react and speak and treat our enemies, even the ones who are doing us harm. Not everyone's going to triumph when we triumph. Not everyone's going to enjoy when we have things going well in our lives. That's not a reason to give up. These people didn't. These people didn't give up. They continue to trust in God. They continue to love God. And sometimes even people bring us down when they have no reason to do so. Or they're lying about us. And as it says in chapter 4 and verse 5, sometimes people just want to frustrate our purpose all day. And we've all had those moments where it just seems like people are trying to get under our skin. If you have kids, you know exactly what that's like. But not everyone's going to be on our side 100% of the time. But we can keep our faith, we can keep our trust in God and know that He's in charge and know that His plan will come to fruition. Now, His plan does come to fruition. We know that from this book. Maybe you're in your life, you don't know what God's plan is and when good is going to start to come. But hang in there. Hang in there. Keep your faith. Keep worshiping. Because no matter what the outside people wanted to do or say against the children of Israel, no one could take God away from these people. And that's important to understand as well. I hope that helped you. And I hope that you can be encouraged by that. Ezra and Nehemiah are some of those books that they're kind of forgotten about. And so I hope what we're doing is we're trying to bring these pages to life and trying to get us just to understand what's going on and see that these people are continuing to get knocked down. But that's not the end of their story. And if you are coming off a year where you feel like you've been knocked down, this is not the end of your story. Get back up, keep going, keep working, and don't let anyone drag you down in the process. Hope you all continue to have a good week. Don't forget to like and share this. Don't forget to comment. Let us know that you are here. Don't forget to ask your questions. We'll try to answer them as well. Y'all continue to have a good week. Hopefully we'll see you on Wednesday night for our Bible study in person at Marion Street Church of Christ.